Okay, so today we're going to get started with exercise 204, and what I'm going to do over the next several weeks of class is essentially we'll do a few days in Rhino, and then we'll do a little bit in VRay, and then we'll do a few more days in Rhino, and we'll do a little bit more in VRay. And I've experimented around a lot with the right way to teach the class, and for me I think the sweet spot is give you enough in Rhino to really start to do something, and then we'll shift to VRay and give you a little more VRay. And then we'll go back and build on your Rhino a little bit more, and then we'll give you a little more VRay. I've done it where we do a bunch of Rhino, and then we do a bunch of VRay. And then everybody forgets all the Rhino that they learned. And so it's better to kind of prop you up as we go. So we're going to keep jumping back and forth. So it'll be 2 or 3 lectures in Rhino, then a lecture in VRay. And then 2 or 3 in Rhino, you get the idea. And each time we'll build on the other subject. So this is your first VRay lecture, so we're going to spend a lot of time in the basics of VRay, understanding materials in general. Each time we go back to VRay, you'll learn some new stuff that makes your stuff look better. We make your renderings look better. And as we continue, ultimately we'll get to like the nighttime renderings and the lighting and all that stuff that everybody wants to do. So it takes a little bit of time, but you got to start somewhere. So this is the baby first steps into VRay, and we'll spend the bulk of our time today talking about that. There's, of course, a little bit of Rhino. You can't do one without the other. A couple other things. The keystroke thing that I was trying to use kept crashing on me today, so I'm trying something different. It's a different keystroke thing. It appears in the upper right corner this time. I don't know whether it's going to be good or not, but I'm experimenting with stuff. So you guys get to watch me experiment, and we'll see. If you hate it, tell me. That's a good thing. But hopefully it'll be helpful. That's obviously my goal in all of this long term. So when I start today, I'm asking you to create a very simple composition of 5 objects. And those 5 objects can be any objects you want. We just need some objects to apply materials to and start kind of the rendering process. So I'm going to start with some basic objects. I'm going to do them in architectural scale, so I'll actually type in a few measurements so that I have some general idea of size. And so I'll start with kind of a wall that goes along the background. So maybe I do, I don't know, at 12 feet, comma, 1 foot, and I'll hit enter. And then my height, I don't know, I'll do it maybe at 8 feet. So I'm just giving myself some general perspective of how big this should be. So that I can see these in solid form, I'm going to switch in the perspective view here from my wireframe into my shaded mode so that I can see that as an actual solid object instead of wireframe. I'm also going to double click on perspective here so that I can see all of my objects at once. And then let's go ahead and do a few more objects. I'll do a little box in front here. Maybe like that. Now that I have a general scale, I can kind of make things up. The standard primitives that I'm using, I use the box first, but underneath there are some of our other objects. So like a cylinder, for example, I could create a cylinder like that. I could come in here and I could say, you know what, I want to create a sphere. We'll stick a sphere here, about like that. I'm going to move this. The sphere by default is on the ground plane. It's not up, so I'd only get a half ultimately when I did the rendering. So I'm going to go ahead and move that. And I'm going to do the move in the front view or in the right side view such that when I move it up, I can kind of see where the ground would be. It doesn't have to be perfect. It could be floating just a little bit, which it is. But I wanted it to be up on that plane rather than being down submerged. So there's 4 objects. We can do a 5th object. Let's do some kind of like let's do a pyramid. Why not? And we'll do a little pyramid there. So I have those 5 objects. I'll double click on the perspective view so that I can see all those objects. And let's spend a little bit of time and get ourselves a bit of a perspective view there. I got to figure out how to turn these mouse clicks off because it's driving me nuts with so many, because I click the mouse so many times. So I don't know. I'll figure it out. I'm working through it. So we now have this basic setup here. And I want to then start going through our basic VRay setups. So a couple things to note about VRay. Number one, it's available, or it should be available, in your top menu structure here under VRay and then VRay Options, etc. If you're not seeing VRay here, it's possible that your current renderer is not set for VRay, in which case you can go to the Render menu and then go to Current Renderer and choose VRay for Rhino. If it's not there, yeah. So I made these appear solid by clicking on this little downward facing triangle and then choosing shaded instead of wireframe. So if you're not seeing VRay, that might be part of the problem. The other thing about VRay is that there is a VRay toolbar that we can choose to load in. For our purposes today, it's not critical that you have it because everything's available under the VRay Options menu. But long term, it may be useful, so I want to go ahead and teach you guys how to load that. And it was supposed to be set so that it would load by default on these computers, but it didn't get set that way. So you have to manually load it. So the first thing you need is you actually need the toolbar. And I think I posted it under today's exercise, but I'm not sure. So let me double check and see if I... yes. So on today's exercise 204, at the bottom of the page here, there is a computer setup files for VRay. I want you to download that file. It's a zip file. Go ahead and show that in your downloads folder. And then I want you to actually extract this file onto your flash drive. So let's make sure it gets into my flash drive, or in my case, my OneDrive. I'm going to put it in my my resources folder. And then I'll go ahead and extract it. I've obviously already done this before. There we go. And there's a few things that are going to extract from there. The thing that's important is the VRay for Rhino v4_TB. That's the file that we ultimately will need. You will want to store this on your flash drive because whenever you want to load the VRay toolbar, that's what you need to load. So make sure it's in a safe place that you know where it is. So I'm going to jump back over into Rhino, and I'm going to load that toolbar by going to the Tools menu and then choosing Toolbar Layout. And with the Toolbar Layout menu open, I'll go to the File menu inside of the Toolbar Layout and say Open. And I'm going to go find that VRay toolbar, which was in my Resources folder, VRay for Rhino. There it is. And I'll click Open. When I do that, these two toolbars for VRay load up for me. One is the standard VRay toolbar. The other one is a VRay Lights toolbar. We will use a little bit of the lights today, but we'll obviously get into that later on in the semester. Those two toolbars come together. Yeah?
Where exactly did you download that?
So if you go to today's exercise from the course website, exercise 204, at the very bottom here, second one down here is computer setup files for VRay toolbar. That's the file that you're going to want. We'll need these other, sometimes it just doesn't come out. Sorry. The materials library we'll need a little bit later, so you could start downloading that if you want, but I'll get to it and come back to it. So I've loaded the VRay toolbars. Once again, that's under Tools, Toolbar Layout, and then File, Open, and select the VRay toolbars. These are the VRay toolbars as they load up. We're going to be working primarily with this top toolbar today, but we'll get to the lights a little bit later on. So before we get moving on into setting up the rest of our file, let's go ahead and look at the VRay Options. I'm going to click on the O tool. It's like a little yellow tag with an O on it. That gets us to the VRay Options menu, or the Options editor. You can also get to it by going to the VRay menu and choosing Options. And that will get you here as well. So the VRay Options editor, when we first look at it, doesn't look too bad, does it? It's pretty small. Not too many options, right? Yeah, okay. So each of these categories is kind of like a drawer that we can close and open. And when you open them, especially if I start to open a large number of them, you can see that suddenly we're getting lots and lots of information. The good news is most of this information you don't have to spend too much time worrying about. The defaults tend to work pretty well. Other times I'll have presets that you can load that will load stuff for you so you don't have to go and find them. However, in the beginning it's important to kind of walk through some of the important pieces of how this really works. So in the VRay option editor here, we have a drawer called Global Switches. The global switches are kind of the big ticket items. And the good news is most of the defaults are just fine. But let's go through them a little bit. A couple things. Under lighting, we want to make sure that the lights are turned on and that the shadows are turned on. You can see that you could actually do a rendering and turn the shadows off if you didn't want them. The other thing that's important to note is this show GI only. That's like ambient light. It's not lights themselves, it's just kind of light that exists. If you wanted to show that only and take away your lights but still have kind of ambient, no directional light in your scene, you could turn that on if you wanted to. I love this one, don't render final image, as if, right? We want to render our final image, so let's not do that. The low thread priority and the progress window are both good. Notice that there's something called batch rendering. You could run batch renders when you're doing lots of renders, but it's not something we'll cover in much depth in this class. Under materials here, we can choose to turn on reflections and refractions or not. Sometimes you're trying to do some base trial renderings and you want to see how it's working and the renders are taking too long. You could uncheck this box to turn off the reflections, and suddenly you'd get a much faster render because it's no longer calculating all the reflections and refractions. These values are just fine. There's a few other options here. When we get to more intense materials and talking about materials, this maps option becomes important. You can choose to turn that off to speed up the renderings, though you sacrifice the quality of the renderings by doing that. And there's also an option when you're struggling with VRay to just override all the materials with a color. So you could like override everything with gray and just see if something's going to turn out. Is my view good? And skip all the materials. That's going to render really, really quickly, which is good. So we're going to leave all the global options set by default. That's good. When I come to the next section here under System, again, most of the options are fine, but I'm going to point something out that you won't need today because our renderings are going to be really small. But I've worked very hard with the computer administrators here, and as much as they have tried to take this away from me and or us, I've managed to get them to continue to keep it. The last time they imaged the computers, I requested that they put this the image render farm on these computers, and I got an email back from the head of IT at DVC saying, I'm sorry, we won't install that because it is a malicious software. And I emailed back and I said, did you just Google search it or did you actually look at the product page for it? And it turns out he Google searched it, and of course that was the first result because people don't know what it is. What we have on the computers in this lab, and it's actually installed in each lab here in the Engineering Technology Building, is something called distributed rendering. And for your purposes today, it won't make any difference. But when you render your final project and you're doing a high quality rendering with lots of materials, that rendering could take somewhere between 10 and 12 hours to run. That's a lot. However, if we allow your computer, which has what's called 8 threads of rendering power, to borrow threads from other computers that aren't being used, guess what? We can shrink that time down to an hour pretty easily. Maybe 30 minutes, depending on the quality of the rendering. That's a really good thing for you guys. So I'm going to teach you guys in this class how to deal with this distributed rendering, how to borrow the rest of the computing power from the lab. So a couple things about it, though, that I'll point out now to kind of remind you and prod you with this, is when you first start up your computer, you see this show up. And you probably noticed that, and you've probably all closed it right away. What is this? Close it. So this is the distributed rendering farm right here. It's all code-based. It's not something where you're going to see nice fuzzy graphics or anything. It's just, let me borrow some computing power. This needs to be open in order to borrow computing power from somebody else's computer. So it's important that you not close this. It's like a courtesy thing. It's a karma thing. If you don't ever close it and you let people borrow from your computer, you're going to have faster renderings long term. Okay? It's karma. So you leave that open. It's not some kind of spyware or something. It is part of this whole render farm. So you leave that open, and actually you can see it when you're letting some of your computer power go out. You can see it start to fill up the screen with code and whatever. So just minimize it, make it go away. It is set to open by default on every computer, so when you first log in, it will open. That was a big fight, but it will do it. Okay? So that's available. If you want to turn on distributed rendering, I will go through this. It's as simple as checking the box for on and then choosing some computer hosts. I will walk you through how to do it when it becomes relevant. Today's class doesn't require distributed rendering at all. The renders we're going to do are small. They'll take no more than 30 seconds or a minute. that's not worth the distributed rendering because it actually takes longer for a shorter render to use distributed rendering because you have to wait for it to go out to all the computers and then wait for the data to come back. So it's only on big, large, high-quality renders that we care about that. So I'll minimize that. Next thing down here is camera. This has a bunch of stuff relating to how you're exposing the rendering when it comes out. We will cover this in more detail. The physical camera is something that becomes very important. We'll get to that when it's relevant. We don't have enough light in our scene to matter just yet. The environment, this has to do with the background. For our purposes today, we're not installing a sun system or a background with clouds and sky and all that stuff. However, I would like it not to have a black sky and a white ground because it never looks right when you have a black sky. So we're going to go ahead and change that right here together. We're going to go to the reflection and refraction background color, which is right here. We're going to click that black box here and change that from black to white. Nothing too exciting. And essentially what we just did was we gave ourselves an entirely white background. So there's no difference between the sky and the ground. It's all white. And this is a good strategy initially when we're doing renderings because we're just focusing on the objects that we're making. We're not focused on, backgrounds and skies and whatever. This also means, however, that things like glass or highly reflective materials like metal won't turn out that great in rendering because the reason that glass looks the way it does is because it reflects the context around it. So if you looked at the glass, across the way in 116 over there, we see the glass because of the reflection of the courtyard in the glass. So if we don't have the courtyard, if we don't have the sky, and we try to render glass, there's nothing to reflect other than white. So it's not going to look right. So for right now, stay away from glass, water, or highly reflective metals because they're just not going to render out that well. When we get to your first assignment, some of you will want to include glass as part of your table and chair. That's okay. I'll help you set up a temporary sky so that you'll get some reflection, though it will be beyond what you need for that part of the class. So we've changed the skylight refraction background to white. We'll go ahead and close that drawer. I'm going to skip down a little bit here to the output drawer. This is where we control the actual size of the rendering that comes out at the end. So it's set right now to give us an 800 by 600 pixel rendering, which is relatively small. It means it will go relatively fast. And that's fine for our purposes. This 800 by 600 does not, however, match the viewport that I'm seeing. The ratio doesn't match. So it's going to end up clipping off the sides. In my particular case, it won't matter that it's clipping off the sides. I'll still get a perfectly good rendering because my objects are centered in the scene. But if your view was set up more like that, where you're trying to render all the way out to either side, you'd be clipping it unnecessarily. You can fix that by coming down here and clicking on the Get View Aspect button, which will match your viewport. You can also then choose to lock the view aspect. So if you changed one of these values, so let's say, I want a higher quality rendering, I want it to be 2000, it will automatically update the height to match. It's, again, a little bit beyond what you need today. If you just rendered at 800 by 600, that would be perfectly fine. So I'm going to drop this back down to 800. We're not concerned with super quality renderings today. We're concerned with getting a rendering. So that's already set. That's good. I'm going to go ahead and close that drawer. The rest of these options we will talk about later on in the semester, if at all. But for right now, that's what you need to know. So I'm going to go ahead and close the VRay option editor. We've got that set up, so I'll click on the little X here. That goes away. No special saving required. It just automatically saves into your file. Next thing we need is we need a little bit more to be able to render our objects nicely. We need a couple more things. Number one, we could really use a ground so that there's something that the stuff sits on. It will allow something for shadows to be cast on. So we're going to do that by creating something called a VRay infinite plane. And this is essentially a special type of object that is represented by a little rectangle on our screen, but that causes a ground to go off into infinity. So it goes off to the horizon in all directions. So when we set up our render, it gives us ground. We can access that by coming over here and clicking on this button, which is the Add VRay Infinite Plane. If you want to type in the command, it's viz infinite plane. And that will then create the VRay infinite plane, which is right here. It is, like I said, represented by a large rectangle. That doesn't mean that that's the edge of the plane. It continues on past that. But it gives us some ground to work with. When you go to manipulate these objects, when they're on top of the infinite plane, you're in all likelihood going to start moving the infinite plane around. So it's better to put that on its own layer. I'm going to come over to the Layers palette here. And I'm going to create a layer down here at layer 5 for environment. And I'll call it environment. Then I'll create a sublayer on the environment layer for infinite plane. I typically call it IP, but for today's purposes, I'm actually going to call it infinite plane. So it's called infinite plane. And I'm going to take that infinite plane and I'm going to put it on the infinite plane layer. Remember to change layers. I have the object selected. I come over to the layer that I want it to go onto, and I right-click and say Change Object Layer. So it's now going to be on the infinite plane layer. Once it's on the infinite plane layer, I'm going to click the lock icon so that I can no longer select it or move it or work with it. That's great. It just exists. So that's there, and it's locked. The next thing that we need in order for the rendering to turn out nicely is we need a basic form of lighting in our scene, some kind of a light to illuminate our objects. So I'm going to, again, in the environment layer, create another sublayer for light. So I have environment as my main layer. I have infinite plane as a sublayer, and I'm going to have light as the next layer. I'm going to double click on light to make that the current layer. I get the little black check mark next to it. So when I create the light, it will show up on the light layer. We're going to use what's called a basic directional light. In our VRay toolbars here, you see that we have things like sun and rectangular light, point light, sphere light, etc. Well, guess what? There's one more button here that doesn't have an icon on it. Go VRay, right? It's the mystery button, which turns out that it's the directional light. That's the one we want. So I apologize that it's the mystery button, but it is the mystery button. So at your VRay toolbar, you come all the way over to the right, and there it is, Create Directional Light. That's the one we want. We could also type in Directional Light, and that would give us our directional light as well. So the thing about a directional light is it's going to ask us the end and then the start point. And it's really hard to specify where this light is because we can't really manipulate this in 3 dimensions as easily as I would like to. So instead of starting with that, I'm actually going to suggest that you start with a box. So I'll come over here to the box. I'll create a box, something like that. And I'll use this box as a guide to create my directional light. So now that I have the box, I'll come up to my mystery directional light button. And I'll snap from that lower corner here to the upper corner right there. And now I have a light that's pointing kind of down and diagonal toward my objects. I can then go in and actually delete the box that I created as a helper, because I don't really need that. I just need the directional light. It doesn't matter how far away from your objects that directional light is. This is just a symbol that represents an infinite number of lights all shining in that one direction. So it's not a spotlight. It won't show up as a cone. It's just kind of like a big field of light that's casting on our objects. So one more time, just for illustration purposes, I create a box first. There's my box. I go up to my directional light. I can type in directional light or click on the directional light button. End of light vector, this would be down at the ground. Start of light direction vector would be up there opposite it. And then I'll select my box and press the delete key so that it's shining down on my objects. So at this point, I can zoom in toward my objects to get a nice rendering view. Maybe it's something like that. That looks pretty good. That's the view that I'm going to render several times. And so because I'm going to continue rendering this view over and over and over again, it's nice to have the same view each time, because maybe I need to adjust something, maybe I end up orbiting, and I want to come back and do the same rendering. This is a very frequent process in Rhino and VRay because you set your view up, you like your view, and you're going to re-render, make some tweaks, come back, re-render again, make some more tweaks, come back, re-render again. If we save the view, it's kind of like a scene in SketchUp. We can always come back to the same view, and we don't have to find that view again or adjust for that view again. So I'm going to save that view by going to the little downward pointing triangle here next to where it says perspective. I'm going to go down to Set View and then choose Named Views. So it's that triangle, Set View, Named Views. This brings up the Named Views dialog box. I'll click Save. And then we can call this something. Let's call it Render 1. And I'll go ahead and say OK. That then saves Render 1. So what happens, and you notice that perspective now changed to Render 1. If I orbit, and I'm working on something, and I work on something, OK, I'm ready to render again, I can go back here to this triangle. I can go to Set View, and I can choose Render 1. And it will jump me right back to that same view to do the rendering again. So this is a good habit to get into whenever you do a render. Save your view first, and then you can go back and do the renders. You'll find in the final project of this class that I'll be asking you to create certain renderings. And if you save the render, work on it some more, change your materials around, change the texture mapping, come back, re-render, re-render. You'll be re-rendering all the time. And so if you have your views saved, it just makes it really easy to jump back to that view. Yeah. So saving the views is the downward pointing triangle next to where it says perspective, probably. Go to Set View and then Named Views. So it's Set View, Named Views. That brings up this little dialog box for named views. Then click on the little disk icon to save it. And then you'll call it something. And that will be saved as a view for you. So I have my view set up. So I've made it through part 1. We went through the VRay basic options. We went through creating an infinite plane. We went through the basic directional light for us. And then we've established a saved named view for our rendering. The next thing that we're going to do is start to assign materials. Before I do that, I'm going to do a test render just to see how this turns out. I'll do that by clicking on the blue circle with an R in it for render. Alternatively, I could click on this blue circle. They'll both do the same thing. And I can confirm that, yes, the render is happening. There's an itty-bitty little bit of shadow right there, but everything's white because everything's default. So it's time to start actually applying some materials. So I'm going to apply my materials by going to the VRay Material Editor. And I can access that by clicking on the yellow sphere here with an M in it. Or I can go up to the VRay menu structure and choose Material Editor. I could also type in VisMatEd to get there. So now that I have this up, and you guys saw this briefly on the first day of class, this is our VRay Material Editor. This is where we load in pre-existing materials. It's also where we can create materials from scratch. And so today, to start out in part 2, we're actually going to create some materials from scratch so you can see what a material is made of in the first place. It will also give you more of an appreciation for the materials that are already made going forward. So first thing we need to do, I have absolutely no materials in my scene. I need to create a material. To create a material, I will right-click here under Scene Materials, and I will select Create Material from the little context menu that appears. And I'm going to choose Standard. You see that there are other types of materials here. If we wanted to use them, we're going to stick with Standard. So Create Material, Standard. And so now, instead of just having Scene Materials, I have Scene Materials, and then I have Default Material. This default material is how we're going to create our first material. I'm going to make this first material red. You can pick any color you want. We're going to end up creating 5 of them. They're all going to be different colors. So I'm going to make the first one red. First thing I'll do is rename the material. So it's not default material. I'll do that by right-clicking on it and saying Rename Material. And we'll call this red, for lack of a better term. And I then want to make my material red. Currently, if I click the Preview button, it's going to show up as gray. That's because the current material is gray. Stay away, by the way, from this Live Update button. on the materials, this loves to crash VRay. So just stay away from that. If you're in the new version of VRay, if you're in VRay 3, it can mostly handle it. But in 1.5, I have not seen pleasant results out of that. When you need to preview it, click the preview button. That'll work. So first thing we need to do is change the color from gray to red. We'll look under the first drawer here. Notice that materials work the same as all the other VRay options. There's drawers. The drawer that's open, they're all open by default. The one that we care about for our purposes today is the diffuse drawer right here. Diffuse essentially means solid color. Solid image, solid color, the primary makeup of this material. We're going to go to the color section here, and we're going to click on the gray square and change that gray square to red. Now, of course, you could pick any red in the color wheel here. There are also a bunch of materials and colors that are, sorry, not materials, colors that are pre-picked here. I'm going to stick with just the basic red. That works for me. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And the color changes from the gray to the red. Notice that when I click the preview button, this sphere is going to change from gray to red. So I've now made a red material. I need to apply that red material to an object in this scene. I'll pick the sphere here. I will right-click on red and say Apply Material to Selection, and it will apply directly to this object. We can't see that it applied to the object because I'm in shaded mode on my view here. So if I want to see it apply to the object, I need to switch from my shaded mode one more down into rendered mode, in which case I'm going to see it as a red object. A word of caution about the rendered mode. Things that are in your Rhino scene don't always show up in a rendered mode. So for example, if I switch back to shaded mode, you see that I have this light here. When I switch into rendered mode, the light is no longer there. Curves like to disappear in rendered mode as well. So just be aware that objects aren't always there when you're seeing it in rendered mode, because this is rendered mode. It would make sense that the light wouldn't show up in rendered mode. So the other thing about rendered mode is just because it looks one way in rendered mode, and I should call it rendered preview mode, doesn't mean that when you actually do the rendering it's going to look like that. A lot of times the rendering is very different from what the rendered mode looks like, but it gives us some approximation. And we can certainly confirm that red was applied to that object. Let me go back to my set view, and I'm going to go back to the render 1 view here. And I could actually render out my work here by clicking the render button, and we could see that, yes, my sphere is actually red and it's showing up as an object. That's a good thing. So I'm going to go through and create several more materials of different colors. So I'm going to once again go to Scene Materials. I'll right-click and say Create Material. So this is good that it happened to me so that you guys can see this. Every once in a while, VRay kind of freaks out and just goes gray. Usually, it'll come back within 30 seconds. It's just kind of a glitch in VRay. If it doesn't, we'll save our Rhino file and open it again later on. So I'm going to go back to Create Material Standard. There's the next default material. We'll call this default material, I don't know, blue. Say OK. I'll come up to my diffuse drawer here. I'll change from gray to blue. I'm going to change to a different color blue. There we go. I can preview it. Yep, there it is. Let's go ahead and make this object blue. I'll right-click on blue and say Apply Material to Selection, and it now shows up as blue because I'm in rendered mode. I'll continue. We'll right-click on Scene Materials. I'll say Create Material Standard. I'm going to pick my color first because I don't know what color I'm going to pick. Let's pick, I don't know, let's pick green. I'll rename this to be green. And I'll say OK. And then I will select this object, right-click, and say Apply Material to Selection. And there it is. So I've got 3 of my objects. I need 2 more materials on the last 2 objects. I will right-click on Scene Materials. I will go to Create Material Standard. And once again, I'll pick a different color. Let's do orange this time. I'll say OK. I will rename this, right-click, Rename material. You could also double click and it'll bring you into the material rename. This is orange. I will right click on orange and say apply material to selection, and there it is. Last material, right click on C materials, create material standard, and we'll do this one, I don't know, we'll do this one in pink. I'll do that for my daughter, why not? Not that she's watching this. I'll say OK, and there it is in pink. We will take that last material, I'll right click on the material and say apply material to selection. There it is. So at this point, I can actually perform a rendering and see what this little scene looks like. So I'll come over and I'll click on the render button, and we'll let Rhino go ahead, or excuse me, VRay go ahead and do the rendering. And so we can see in this little preview that yes, it's casting a shadow. So this sphere is casting a shadow onto these two objects. These objects would be casting a shadow probably right behind this object in the front onto that green cube as well. So we say, OK, this is a decent first rendering. I'm going to go ahead and save this rendering. So I'll click on the little save icon right here. It's the disk icon. And I'm going to save it into today's folder. So let me put it into our folder for today. Render 1. There we go. And I've saved it. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to move down and I'm going to adjust the transparency of two of the objects. Now the interesting thing here is the material works independent of the objects. I've assigned 5 objects, 5 different materials. But if I make a change to a material, it will apply to all objects with that material on it. So for example, if I had a 6th object, here, and I took that 6th object and I applied the blue material selection like that, I would have 2 objects with the same blue material on them. If I made a change to the transparency of the blue material, it would apply to both objects. So this is not object specific, it's material specific. So let's go ahead and make that change. Under blue here, I'm going to select it so that it's highlighted, and then I'll again go to the diffuse tab. Before, we changed the color to blue, and we ignored the side that said transparency. The transparency side is controlled by the value that is the color here in transparency. So black is completely opaque. White is completely transparent. Any gray value in between is then that level of transparency. So it takes a little bit of getting used to. But to change the transparency, I would go and click on the black square here under transparency, and I would change to a different gray value. So right now we're at black. If I switch to dark gray, for example, and then said OK, and then previewed my object, guess what? It's become transparent. If I clicked on the gray and made it light gray, and then went back to preview, it's become very transparent. So the level of transparency is controlled by the color value of that square. Generally speaking, we'll stick with either dark gray or light gray. Those are pretty good. Notice at the bottom here, there is a whole spectrum of grays that are available to you to pick if you wanted to fine-tune the control. But generally, either light gray or dark gray will work. I'm going to leave the blue as dark gray for right now. And then I'm going to also change the, let's change the pink. And I'll change the transparency of the pink to be a little bit lighter. We'll go to just say gray. And now it's a little bit lighter. I could jump all the way to making that, the light gray. The challenge here is that it's going to start to become very faint when I do the rendering. So let's go ahead and close that for now. And it's time to perform another rendering to check on how we did. I'll go ahead and click on the render button, and we'll let it do its rendering. If you find that you've clicked on the rendering button and you're not seeing anything, chances are the render menu is just minimized down here. So we'll make that a little bit bigger. And now we can see the new rendering right there. So these two objects have become transparent. We're seeing the shadow being cast in and around these other objects. So that's pretty good. Let's go ahead and save this file. I have render 1A. Now I have render 1B, and we'll go ahead and save it. So that's adding transparency to the materials. The next thing is to start to make the materials reflective. Right now, our materials are just opaque. They're not reflecting any light at all. If we want them to reflect light, we have to start to add reflection. And you'll see that as soon as we add reflection, the rendering is going to take a little bit more time, because it then has to calculate the reflections. So let's go ahead and start adding a reflection to at least one of the objects. I'll go to my VRay material editor. So I'll click on the M. I'm going to start with the red object here. It's a solid object, but I'll make it shiny. And I'll do that by right-clicking on the name. And I'm going to choose Create Layer, and we'll see Reflection listed. So I'll go to Create Layer and then Reflection. And this then creates a reflection drawer that didn't exist before. So we had diffuse before, we had options before, we had maps before, but we didn't have reflection. And so as soon as that's on, if we click on Preview, my object goes from being opaque to being shiny. And so that then changes. We have the ability also to adjust how shiny the object is. And I'll get to that in just a second. This first option, we're going to leave the defaults, and that's now shiny. Remember, this applies to the material automatically, or to the object automatically. So all I would have to do is go in and perform another rendering. And this red object is not as red anymore, but you could see all the halo, the reflections of the various objects in it, because it's now reflecting other objects, because it's shiny. So when it comes time to start adjusting these things, I'd go back to my material editor. We're going to do it to some of the other materials. I could go to blue, for example. I could add a reflection to blue, so I'll right-click, and I'll say Create Layer Reflection. That then gives us the reflection drawer here that I can adjust. So if I wanted to change how shiny an object is, so there it is with some shine on it. If I wanted to change how shiny an object is, I would go into my reflection, and under General, there's a blue box with a capital M in it under Reflection. This changes how shiny the object is. I'll click on it, and it is called a Fresnel Reflection. And as we come down here, there's a value for IOR, or Index of Refraction. This value is a known value for a variety of materials. So if you knew you wanted to create a specific material, let's say a diamond, for example. If you wanted your material to match up with the shininess of a diamond, you could actually do a Google search for IOR Diamond. And here it is, Index of Refraction list. And we could come down here and find diamond, and it's 2.418. We would then take that value, that 2.418, jump back into Rhino and say, there's my index of refraction. I want it to be 2.418. There it is. And I'll go ahead and say OK. That then changes the shininess of this material. And you can see in the preview that it's now more shiny. So I like to point out the correlation between the real-world materials and the rendered materials. And you can see that the shininess depends on what material you're picking. And they actually have in these lists a ridiculous number of materials depending on what it is you're trying to render. And so it's worth spending a little bit of time looking at it. But you can find some interesting values here depending on what it is. You know, like who knew that the rock salt index of refraction was 1.516? Like, that's kind of neat. Anyway, you can go through, or better yet, white rum. Let's find out what that is. You get the idea. So these things are known things, and if you were going to try to match up or create a material like a diamond, for example, you would go and look at this value so you would match the index of refraction to the actual material itself. And the great thing about Google is you can do this really easily. You just put a Google search in and you can find out what that material is. Okay, so I have that index of refraction assigned here for the blue diamond, for example. I'm going to move on and keep adjusting. Let's go to pink and let's change the index of refraction of this. I'll right click on pink. I'll say create layer and let's do a reflection. There it is. I'm going to click on the M next to general refraction and I'm going to change this one to be something else. And I could just make it up. If it was like a really shiny thing, we might go up to maybe like 4. And let's take a look. Yeah, it's really, really shiny. We're getting a lot of reflections there. And we'll do one more. We did red already. Let's do green. I'll right click. I'll say create layer. And we'll do reflection on green here. And maybe this one is much less. Let's do it at like 1.1. And I'll say OK. And it's not going to be nearly as shiny. So now let's go back and perform our rendering. So I'll click on the render button here. I'll bring up my render. And you'll notice that the render suddenly takes a lot more time. And the reason that it takes a lot more time is there's so much reflected light back and forth that Rhino has to calculate the light beam as it bounces between objects. Rhino and VRay, generally the rule of thumb is that it calculates 16 bounces. So if I had a light ray and it hit this first object, that would be 1 bounce. Then it would go and hit the second object, that would be 2 bounces. Then that would go over and hit this third object, that would be 3 bounces. That light would then come back and hit the floor, that would be 4. You get the idea. It would go 16 times. And that's part of what starts to make our objects look real. Because in real life, light bounces an infinite number of times until the light source is exhausted. So it's important to recognize that that's part of what gives us a realistic rendering. I'm going to go ahead and click on the save icon here to save this version. And this was version C. And I'll click Save. There it is. OK, we're going to move on into, we did our reflections. The next thing, oh, I kind of did step 9 and step 10 together. In the handout here, under step 9, you just add the reflections. And then you go back and you change the IOR values. I did them kind of all in one, which is fine. The last thing is that we can also change the reflection glossiness of a particular material. So I'm going to click on the M here, and I'll do this with the green one here for a second. We have our standard reflection, but we also have a glossiness. We have a highlight value and a reflect value. If you decrease these values, the object will become less shiny. Let me go back to the red one because it'll be a little bit more obvious. There's our preview. Let me take the highlight here and let me make it 0.75, and then I'll click preview. And you'll see that it's not as crisp along the edges. Furthermore, if I take the reflect value and make it 0.75 and I preview it, it's a lot more blurry. Do you guys see how that changes? So this is if I was switching from, say, a very shiny material to something that was still reflective but not as reflective, not shiny, like a matte plastic, for example. It's still reflective, but it's not super reflective anymore. So you can change that by just adjusting this glossiness value, either the highlight or the reflection glossiness. The reflect is a little bit stronger change. So this may be 0.75, might be too much. We'll go 0.85, for example. And we get a little bit more definition of what it's reflecting. I could switch to, say, the orange wall in the background. Oh, VRay's tanking out on me here. Let's go to the orange wall in the background here. Oh, I don't have a reflection on that. Let me go to the green. And here under the reflect, I might go to 0.5. And I'm really not seeing much. There's a little bit of reflection to it. This would be like the plastic on the monitor of the computer. There's a little bit of reflection, but not too much. And then we'll go ahead and render. If you find yourself making this reflect lower than 0.5, you might as well just take it off altogether and not have the reflection because it's wasting a lot of computer processing power to do the rendering. Unless, of course, you're doing a very fine rendering where you want, you're doing a rendering of the keyboard and you just want to see the keys and you want them to reflect exactly how they would reflect in real life. But if I was rendering this room, I wouldn't make the plastic of the keyboard have a very small reflection value because I'd waste a bunch of rendering on that isn't going to be seen in a wide angle rendering of this room. So you always want to keep that in mind. So those two are done. I'll go ahead and go back, and I'll click on the render icon. And we'll let it process. And you can see the big difference in the red sphere. I think that's the most obvious one as to what it's done to the reflection itself. So I'll let that one finish up. Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And this is version D. And I'll go ahead and click Save. So we've made it through part 2. We're going to move on to part 3. And so this is where, no matter how much time you want to spend making perfect materials, sometimes it's easier to just pick a material that somebody else made. And so there are a bunch of default materials, and there's a material library that I'm going to ask that you guys download and keep for the class. It's a collection of materials that students have made that default come with Rhino but don't always get installed correctly, that I've made and that I've adjusted accordingly. They cover a lot of the things that you guys will ask to have to render. So a lot of the basics are covered in there. Every once in a while somebody asks for a very specific material, and we have to sit down and we have to make it because it's not something that we already have. And that's a really fun process, but it's just kind of a side shoot from what we're doing. We will spend a day in class where we make custom materials. So you will learn the process of doing that. But for right now, I want to walk you through how you would load and keep that material library at your disposal. So on today's exercise, exercise 204 here, at the very bottom, I have a download VRay material library for your flash drive. If you click on that, it will take you, I think, to a Dropbox site. No, it'll take you to downloadable resource packages, which then has, if we go to Archie 136 right here, download zip archive of VRay materials. Go ahead and click on that. And it will take you to a Dropbox site because I want them to host the 1.5 gig file for you guys to download as opposed to me. It's going to go faster if Dropbox gives it to you. So go ahead and click on the link. It will take you here. You do not have to sign in for Dropbox or anything. You can just go ahead and download it. It's available right here under download. I will click and I will say direct download, and it will start downloading. That's a little smaller than I thought it was. Anyway, let that start to download. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. The other thing that is available on the course website is if you go to resources, you'll see something called the VRay Materials Library. And this VRay Materials Library has a bunch of VRay materials that students have worked with and that they've made along the way. And so some of these materials are great. Anything with the Digital Tools logo on it is something that I've worked on or touched or tweaked so that I feel like it's pretty well resolved. The ones that don't have that logo on it are ones that students have created in the past. If you're looking for something specific, you can search for it, but you can also get into, oh, I want stone, let me see more various stone options that people have created along the way, and go from there. So it's a way of kind of categorizing things, and if you're looking for something specific, you can look for it. Like I said, we'll spend a day in class later on creating materials from scratch, and I'll walk you through how you would do that in the first place, which is how these materials tend to be made. It's part of that lecture. So if there's something you really, really wanted, you could create it. And the more time you spend on creating the perfect material, the better the rendering is going to be long term. A lot of these have already been made, and most of the ones that have the Digital Tool logo on them are ones that are included in the material package that you're downloading. So it's almost done and finishing its download. We'll give it a little bit more time to load. Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and click this arrow. I'm going to show it in its folder. It's a zip file. We can't use it until it's extracted. So right-click on it and say Extract All, and then choose a location on your flash drive. For me personally, in my OneDrive or in my flash drive, I have a folder called Resources. Inside of that, I have a folder called VRay, and inside of that, I have a folder for VRay Materials. That's where I put all of my VRay materials. I'm going to encourage you to put it in a place on your flash drive where you know where it is and where it's going to stay for the rest of the semester. If you move your material library, the link between the material and the files necessary to render it will be broken, and you'll have to reload the materials. It's kind of like when you plug in your flash drive into a different port on the computer, and it doesn't recognize the same drive letter, and then it doesn't know where the material files are. Some materials will load without worrying about that. Other materials need to have their resources with them. So I've gone ahead and I've already extracted it. I'm not going to do that again. It's going to go in my VRay materials folder. So once I have that, remember it has to be extracted. Don't just double click on it and get into the VRay materials here. We can go ahead and we can load those materials into our scene. So I'm going to come back to my scene here. And actually, I probably should save this. Let's go ahead and save it before I lose it. OK. So I have this saved. I'm going to go back into my VRay material editor. I'll click on the M right there. And instead of creating a material, I'll go to the same scene materials. I'll right click, and instead of create, I'm going to move one down into load material. We're not going to deal with material collections. We're just going to do them one by one. So I'm going to go into load material, and I'm going to go to my flash drive, into my resources folder, into VRay materials, and here's a list of all the materials that are included with that download. So at this point, it's just a matter of picking a material and then installing it onto an object. So for example, I could start with, I don't know, let's do brick. There's a couple different bricks that are available here. Let's do the old dirty brick. Sure, why not? And as I'm doing this, I'm looking for a file called .vismat. And generally, it's within the folder here. This vismat file loads all of the settings for this particular material. So I'll go ahead and click on it, and I'll say Open. I will then have a material listed in my scene materials for brick, red, old, dirty. There it is. This material relies on some other files. So if I were to go to my flash drive and open up that brick folder and look at the old, dirty brick here, there's some other files included in this material. VRay needs to know where all these files are. That's why where you store them on your flash drive is important. You just want to be consistent about where they are. So now that I have that loaded, all I have to do is select an object. Let's do it on the wall here. Right click and say Apply Material to Selection, and suddenly that becomes red brick. Now I know that this does not look that great. It's way too large for the material. We're going to get to how to fix that, but that's another lecture. So it doesn't matter that it doesn't look great. We're still just applying the materials themselves. So if I were to render this at this point, this orange object is now going to be a brick wall. I'm going to go back into, we'll let this continue rendering in the background. I'm going to go back to my VRay materials. I'm going to load some other materials. Let's go ahead and load material. We'll go back here. You could play around and load a variety of different materials. There's fabrics, for example. There's different woven fabrics. Let's go ahead and load the woven red fabric here. There it is. I could apply that to a specific object, and that's then going to become that fabric. You can see in the preview it has a little bit of the texture on it. And when I went to render it, we would get that little bit of texture rendered. There you go. You're seeing the texture. It's a little bit blurry because our render quality isn't that high, but you get the idea of how this works. So I'll continue, and I'm going to pick 5 materials, and I'm going to assign those 5 materials to my objects. Apply material to selection here, or excuse me, load material. Like I said, water and glass are not our friends right now, but you can choose them if you want, but the rendering is not going to turn out that great because we have no context around our objects. There are some landscape materials like grass that you could apply. It may or may not work because you may need to adjust some settings for them to apply nicely. There are some meshes and screens, some of which have holes in them. So let me go to the mat with the round holes here. Right, so this is a mesh with some holes in it that we can see through. I could apply that to one of these objects as well. So let me go ahead and take this object, for example, and apply the material to selection. There it is. And when I went back and I rendered it, that would have some transparency through the object itself. You can see that when I load up more complicated materials, the rendering time slows down. That should be fairly obvious. So I want you to go through and I want you to load up 5 new materials of your choosing and apply them to each object. When that's done, you'll do one last rendering and save that. That gets us through part 3, except for step 14. The very last piece of that is to open your file from last class. Remember that house that you were working on? And load a material onto the walls of your house. Chances are the scale of the material is going to be off. The bricks are going to be too big. That's okay. That's to be expected. But it's a way of reinforcing the whole concept of how you're applying the materials and you're able to load them, etc. You don't have to worry about scaling. We will get to scaling the materials. That's something called texture mapping. And we'll spend a whole lecture just talking about texture mapping. It'll actually be the next VRay lecture that we have, where we'll talk about texture mapping and correcting these kinds of problems. Okay, so that gets you through today. When you go to post these files, we're going to post them. For those of you that were in Digital Tools 135, we're going to post it like a gallery, where we load everything and load them all up in a slideshow. If you were not in 135, no worries. I'll help you post it. I'm going to do it live for you right now. So that you guys can see it. I was kind of hoping that this rendering would finish, but obviously it's taking a little bit longer because of the transparency and the reflections. So I'll go ahead and post it without this for right now. To do your post, we're going to go to the Digital Tools site. I'm going to go to the new post. I'm going to give this a title. This is exercise 204. There we go. And in order to upload my images, I'm going to click on the tab here that says Gallery. Normally we just stick to the Content tab. I'm going to click on the tab that says Gallery. Oh, good. There's actually instructions on the back of the handout. My morning class, they didn't make the copies on the back of the handout, so we missed that part. But you guys have it just in case you get lost. And I will click on the blue button here for Insert Gallery or Add Images. I can then upload my files. I'll click on Select Files. And we'll go into today's folder. Here's all of my files. I do not need the Rhino file, so I'm going to skip the Rhino file and take the rest of the files. I'll click Open. It will go through and it will open all the files. It'll go through and say 100% and then crunching, 100% and then crunching. So you just have to wait while it does this. There you go. When they're done, I'm going to click this Save All Changes button. Perfect. Then I'll close this. So I'll click on the little close icon, and that's it. I will move back to the Content tab there, and I will scroll down, and under Format on the right side, I'm going to change to a gallery. And as soon as I do that, the toggle here for a slideshow shows up. I can click on the toggle, and that'll give me a nice little slideshow on my post. We'll continue and scroll all the way down to the very bottom. I'm going to click on Set Featured Image. I still need a featured image of this post. I'll pick any one of those objects. For me, because I'm the administrator, everybody's uploads show up. For you, it'll just be yours, so it's much easier to pick. I can also filter by just those uploaded to this post. There they are. I'll pick the one that I like, and I'll set that as the featured image. There it is. I will scroll back up and make sure to categorize my post. This is exercise 204. That's then established. I don't actually have to do anything in the content area itself. It will show up automatically. At this point, I can click Publish. And there we go. It is published. I'm going to click on the link here, or View Post, to make sure it actually loads correctly. There it is. This is the little slideshow that I was talking about, where you can scroll through and see all the images. It just kind of consolidates everything into being simple. If you get a little bit lost because you haven't done one of those before, not a problem. You're not being graded on how well you can follow me on that part. I'll just come around and help you do it when it comes time to post. So the purpose today is to get familiar with VRay, to load up your materials, play around with them a little bit. If you're feeling really confident, that's great. Go ahead and play around with some other materials, see what happens, create some new objects, get used to this process of assigning materials. Remember that you can assign materials by layer. When I did my work here, I did not separate my objects onto different layers. I could separate them onto different layers and apply the material to the layer rather than to the object itself. The advantage there is if I had multiple objects, i.e. this, and I wanted them to have the same material on them, if I had them on a layer, I would only have to assign the material once to the layer, and all the objects on the layer would have that material on it, which can be really useful in a bigger project. In the scope of this, we only have 5 or 6 objects. No big deal. We can do it individually. So just certainly something to be aware of. Question?
Let's say you apply a reflection, and then you decide you don't want to have that on that.
Yes, that's great. Sure. So I have, under red here, I have a reflection currently applied. We can see it. There's the reflection. All I have to do is right-click on red, and I can say, oh, I thought I could say it there. No, it's not remove material. Maybe I have to do it here. Let's come back to the reflection. Sorry, I thought I could delete the layer, but for whatever reason, it's not letting me. Ah, here it is. I have to highlight it, and then I can say remove layer.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I was just on the wrong thing. I was going, wait a minute, I know I'm supposed to be able to do it there. So instead of being on the material itself, go to the reflection layer right there, right-click on the reflection layer, and say remove layer. That will make the reflection go away. There you go. And it'll go away. So just make sure you're on that sub-layer. Other questions? No, that was a good one. Thank you. All right, great. I'll turn you guys loose to finish, and we'll go from there.